Carl Jung uncovered something about human suffering that will permanently transform the way you interpret the most difficult years of your life. When you look back, you probably see only pain. You may believe those dark years were a mistake, a detour, wasted time that left you with scars that serve no purpose. You may think you fell behind while others moved forward. But what Jung discovered overturns everything society has conditioned you to believe about hardship. We are taught to avoid suffering at all costs. We are told that pain is proof that something went wrong, that struggle is a sign of weakness, that success should feel smooth and effortless. Yet Jung observed something radically different. The individuals who endure the most brutal inner experiences do not merely survive them. They undergo a transformation that reshapes the architecture of their psyche. They develop depth, resilience, perception, and inner authority that those who have lived easy, comfortable lives may never fully comprehend. Think about it carefully. A person who has never had to confront their own inner chaos remains on the surface of existence. They may function well, they may appear stable, even successful, but they do not know the full range of their own being. They have never descended into the underworld of their own unconscious. They have never faced the parts of themselves they fear. Without that descent, there is no true depth. Jung realized that psychological suffering, when faced consciously and integrated rather than denied, does not enter your life to destroy you. Its deeper function is to forge you. It reshapes you into someone who did not exist before that pain. If you have endured years that shattered your sense of identity, years that isolated you, forced you to question everything you believed, or stripped away the illusions that once gave you comfort, Jung would not call you damaged. He would say, you are being prepared. Life, in its mysterious intelligence, trains certain individuals through fire. It exposes them to realities most people would not have the strength to withstand, not as punishment, but as initiation. Throughout his life's work, Jung studied what it truly means to become a whole human being. He called this the process of individuation. And he discovered something unbreakable about it. It always requires a descent into darkness. There are no exceptions. Those who developed the strongest minds, the most awakened consciousness, and the deepest psychological power were always those who walked through their own inner hell and returned with insight. They did not transform in spite of their suffering. They transformed because of it. The pain was not an obstacle on the path. It was the path. The years that seemed unbearable in your life were not accidental chapters. They were structural. They built capacities within you that you could not have developed in comfort. They sharpened your perception. They expanded your emotional range. They forced you to discover inner resources you did not know you possessed. And the reward for enduring those years is not superficial success. It is psychological authority. It is self-knowledge. It is the quiet strength of someone who has seen their own depths and did not turn away. To understand the magnitude of this, we do not need abstract theory. We need to look at the life of the man who discovered it. Carl Jung did not arrive at these conclusions from a safe intellectual distance. His understanding was born from a crisis that nearly dismantled him completely. In his early 40s, Jung appeared successful by every external measure. He was a respected psychiatrist, internationally recognized, with a family, status, and the intellectual endorsement of Sigmund Freud. He was seen as Freud's natural successor. His career trajectory pointed upward. Stability surrounded him. Then, everything collapsed. His relationship with Freud fractured in a deeply painful and public way. That rupture did not merely end a professional alliance, it triggered something far more dangerous inside him. Jung entered what he later called a confrontation with the unconscious. This was not a passing sadness or a mild depressive episode, it was a total destabilization of his inner world. For years, this scientifically trained psychiatrist began experiencing intense visions. He saw rivers of blood flooding Europe in his dreams long before the outbreak of World War I. He heard voices. He encountered symbolic figures emerging from his psyche. The ground beneath his reality felt unstable. He struggled to work. He struggled to read. At times, he could barely function. The question that haunted him was the same one many people ask in their darkest nights. Am I losing my mind? As a psychiatrist, Jung knew the symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia intimately. He feared he was disintegrating from within. The terror of losing sanity was not theoretical. It was visceral and immediate. This is where Jung's story becomes essential for you. Most people, when faced with such inner chaos, attempt to suppress it. They distract themselves. They numb the experience. They seek to silence the discomfort as quickly as possible. Jung chose the opposite path. Instead of fleeing from the storm, he stepped directly into it. He began documenting every vision, every voice, every symbolic encounter. He engaged in dialogue with the figures emerging from his unconscious as if they were autonomous personalities. He wrote and illustrated these experiences in a massive red leather-bound volume now known as the Red Book. He did not resist the collapse of his former identity. He allowed it to dissolve. He permitted himself to be undone. And what emerged on the other side was not a broken man. What emerged was a new psychological framework that would revolutionize modern depth psychology. Jung realized something profound during this ordeal. The crisis was not attempting to annihilate him. It was expanding him. The version of himself that had existed up to that point, the rigid academic, the loyal disciple of Freud, was too narrow to contain the totality of who he was becoming. His previous identity functioned like clothing that had become too tight. It had to tear apart for something larger, more authentic, and more aligned with his deeper self to emerge. The unbearable pain, the fear of madness, the disorientation were the sounds of an old self breaking apart. What Jung discovered through his own descent was not a personal anomaly. It revealed a universal psychological law. Every individual who achieves genuine psychological wholeness undergoes some form of symbolic death and rebirth. The ego structures that once provided stability eventually become restrictive. They must be dismantled so the deeper self can reorganize the personality around a more authentic center. This is the hidden meaning of your darkest years. When everything seemed to fall apart, when relationships ended, when your identity cracked, when your beliefs dissolved, when isolation surrounded you, something deeper was reorganizing itself. The unconscious was surfacing material that had long been buried. Old narratives were dying. False identifications were disintegrating. It did not feel like transformation. It felt like destruction. But psychologically, destruction and transformation are often the same event, viewed from different stages of the process. From within the collapse, you see only loss. From beyond it, you see reconfiguration. The individuals who avoid this descent may maintain external stability, but they often remain strangers to themselves. They never confront their shadow. the repressed parts of their personality. They never integrate their fear, anger, vulnerability, or hidden desires. Without that integration, they remain fragmented, even if they appear functional. Jung insisted that wholeness does not mean perfection. It means integration. It means acknowledging both light and darkness within oneself, and that integration cannot occur without friction. It cannot occur without crisis. It requires confrontation with everything you once avoided. If you endured years that felt like psychological winter, you were not being abandoned by life. You were being initiated into a deeper layer of your own psyche. The strength you now possess may not always be visible to others, but it is structural. You perceive nuance more clearly. You sense falseness more quickly. You tolerate ambiguity better. You carry a gravity that only experience can produce. The reward for enduring your descent is not applause, it is inner solidity. When Jung emerged from his confrontation with the unconscious, he did not return to his former self. He returned transformed. His theories of archetypes, the collective unconscious, the shadow, and the self were not abstract constructs. They were mapped from lived experience. He became proof that the psyche, when allowed to complete its descent, reorganizes itself at a higher level of complexity. Your suffering was not meaningless. It was formative. The years you thought broke, you were sculpting capacities invisible at the time. They forced you to differentiate your true voice from borrowed beliefs. They compelled you to stand alone psychologically. They stripped away dependencies that would have limited you later. The majority of people never undergo this depth of restructuring because they never reach the threshold that forces it. But if you did, it means your psyche demanded expansion. And expansion always feels like rupture before it feels like growth. If you are still in the midst of that process, understand this. The collapse is not the final chapter. It is the transition between identities. The old configuration of who you were cannot sustain who you are becoming. What feels like falling apart is often the necessary fragmentation before a more integrated structure forms. Jung's life demonstrates that the descent into darkness is not a detour from the path. It is the path towards psychological wholeness. The symbolic death you experienced was not an error in your story. It was a prerequisite for becoming someone capable of holding greater awareness, greater responsibility, and greater inner authority. Those terrible years were not wasted time. They were initiation. And what emerges after initiation is not the person who entered the fire. It is someone deeper, steadier, and more aligned with their true center. What Jung later observed in his patients confirmed what he had already lived through himself. The individuals who arrived at his office carrying the heaviest burdens, those shattered by devastating losses, betrayed in ways they believed they could never forgive, or broken down by complete nervous collapse, were paradoxically the very ones who carried the greatest potential within them. They were not weak cases. They were not hopeless. In many ways, they were the ideal candidates for profound transformation. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. What truly happens when your life is comfortable? When everything unfolds according to plan? When there are no major conflicts? When the money is sufficient? When your relationships appear stable and predictable? In those seasons, you are granted the luxury of remaining asleep. You can preserve your illusions without consequence. You can continue believing the narratives you've constructed about yourself. You can avoid confronting your shadow, that hidden dimension of your psyche that quietly shapes your choices from behind the curtain. When life is smooth, unconsciousness costs nothing. It feels free. There is no immediate penalty for deceiving yourself while the sun is shining. You can pretend the emptiness in your relationship is depth. You can convince yourself that your work has meaning simply because it pays the bills. You can suppress your fears and insecurities because nothing is forcing them to the surface. As long as the external structure holds, the internal cracks remain invisible. But when real suffering arrives, not minor inconvenience, not temporary discomfort, but the kind of pain that penetrates to the bone and refuses to be ignored, everything changes. The illusions that once seemed sustainable suddenly collapse under their own weight. Comfortable lies expose themselves as frauds. The roles you've been playing begin to disintegrate. Jung discovered that severe suffering acts like a corrosive acid. It dissolves everything in your life that is not authentic. It strips away the decorations, the masks, the social performances. Suddenly, you can no longer pretend that the relationship that drains you is nourishing. You can no longer deny that your career feels meaningless. You can no longer sweep your fears under the rug because the rug itself has been violently pulled away. The shadow, that part of you you have repressed for years, perhaps decades, demands recognition. It will not accept another rejection. And at this stage, you are forced into consciousness. Not because you bravely chose enlightenment. Not because you heroically decided to grow. No one willingly abandons a pleasant dream to enter a nightmare. You awaken because remaining asleep is no longer possible. Unconsciousness stops being an option. You can no longer afford the luxury of not knowing who you are. This forced awakening is what Jung observed in those patients who underwent the most radical transformations. Often, this intense and even violent inner process led to changes far deeper and more enduring than years of voluntary therapy or countless self-help books ever could. Why? Because when you choose to change on your own terms, your ego is still in control. You decide what to examine and what to avoid. You select which flaws to improve and which wounds to ignore. But when suffering strikes, the ego loses its authority. Life seizes you by the throat and compels you to confront what you have avoided for decades. Jung noted that these dark years are not random misfortunes. They are not cosmic punishment or meaningless bad luck. They serve a precise function within the process he called individuation, the gradual integration of the unconscious into consciousness, the becoming of who you truly are. These difficult seasons are designed to strip away everything false so that only what is real can remain. Think about your own life. Those moments of crisis were burning down your defenses. They were dismantling the walls you constructed to protect yourself. Walls that, in truth, were imprisoning you. They isolated you deliberately, forcing you to develop a relationship with yourself, rather than continuously seeking your identity in the approval of others. The man who loses everything is confronted with a question he has never had to answer before. What is it that no one can take from me? The woman betrayed by everyone she trusted learns where true trust must begin, within herself. The person who hits rock bottom and feels as though they are about to disintegrate often discovers, to their astonishment, that within them exist survival resources they never knew they possessed. These lessons cannot be taught in a classroom. They cannot be absorbed passively through a podcast or acquired by reading a book. They must be lived, endured, embodied. And if you are listening to this and feel a heaviness in your chest, it is likely because you have lived through something that reshaped you in ways you are still trying to understand. But here is where the story becomes more complex, and where Jung made a distinction that changes everything. Yes, suffering breaks illusions, it exposes falsehood, it tears away denial. But pain does not automatically build character. Suffering alone does not make you wiser or stronger. In fact, if you look around carefully, you will notice that most people who suffer do not emerge enlightened. They do not become sages. They do not become resilient heroes. Most people break and remain broken. They grow bitter. They close themselves off from the world. They entrench themselves in a victim narrative, repeating endlessly the story of what was done to them, what they lost, how unfair life has been. They construct walls so high around their hearts that nothing can enter again. Not pain, but not light either. Over time, they calcify. Their identity fuses with their wound. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. Trauma can shrink a person's world. It can harden them into defensiveness. It can turn suffering into a permanent identity. And when this happens, the original pain is compounded by isolation, rigidity, and resentment. Yet, and this is the crucial observation, Jung also noticed something else. A very small percentage of people, a rare minority, respond to devastation in an entirely different way. Faced with the same magnitude of loss, the same betrayal, the same collapse, they do something extraordinary. They do not become hardened. They become deep. Instead of armoring themselves against life, they develop what Jung described as psychological depth. This depth is the rare capacity to hold complexity without fleeing from it. It is the ability to sit with the paradox that existence is both terrible and beautiful at the same time. It is the strength to remain present with reality as it is, rather than fighting endlessly against it or wishing it were different. These individuals do not deny their suffering. They do not romanticize it. They allow it to transform them by engaging with it consciously. They ask themselves difficult questions. They examine their own shadow instead of projecting it outward. They take responsibility for their inner world, even when the outer world has treated them unjustly. So the essential question emerges: what separates these two groups? What determines whether suffering will destroy and embitter you or refine and elevate you? Why does pain turn some people rigid and others reflective? Why does it imprison some and liberate others? The answer does not lie in the amount of suffering. It lies in the relationship one develops with it. It lies in whether the pain is resisted blindly or faced consciously. It lies in whether the ego clings to its narrative of victimhood or surrenders to a deeper transformation. And in that choice, often made in the darkest moments, the direction of a life is decided. Jung discovered something that most people misunderstand about suffering. It is not the severity of the trauma that determines who breaks and who transforms. Two individuals can endure the exact same tragedy, lose the same person, experience the same betrayal, watch the same dream collapse, and yet end up in completely opposite places. One becomes bitter, fragmented, and trapped in resentment. The other becomes deeper, wiser, strangely illuminated from within. The difference is not in what happened to them. The difference is in whether they dared to face what happened or whether they tried to escape it. This is where most people fail, and their failure is understandable, because the human instinct is to run from pain. We are wired to avoid discomfort. We distract ourselves, numb ourselves, intellectualize, spiritualize, rationalize. Jung observed that those who tried to skip over their pain, those who sedated it with addictions, buried it in endless work, denied it by pretending everything was fine, or rushed to give it a premature positive meaning by saying things like, "Everything happens for a reason," before they had even allowed themselves to cry. Those people became stuck. The pain that is avoided does not disappear. It does not dissolve because you ignore it. It retreats into the shadow and begins to operate your life from the darkness. Unprocessed grief becomes anxiety. Suppressed anger becomes passive aggression. Denied fear becomes control. What you refuse to face does not vanish. It simply gains power in hidden ways. Jung called this the shadow. The parts of you that remain unconscious yet influence your choices, relationships, and reactions. And when pain is exiled there, it quietly shapes your destiny. But the people who transformed were the ones who did something counterintuitive. They did not run. They allowed themselves to feel the pain fully, without anesthesia, without rushing toward relief. They sat alone in dark rooms, not knowing when the sun would rise again. They resisted the desperate urge to fix everything immediately. They did not demand quick answers from the universe. They stayed with the wound. You have done this, even if you did not realize it at the time. There were nights when you were alone, with a kind of pain that could have shattered anyone, and yet you did not flee. You remained. You breathed through the panic. You endured the emptiness. You faced the silence that felt endless. And that act, so quiet, so invisible to the outside world, was not weakness. It was strength in its purest form. It was the refusal to abandon yourself. Jung would say that in those moments, something extraordinary was being forged inside you. He called it psychological gold. To explain this, Jung turned to an ancient metaphor that fascinated him: alchemy, not the medieval fantasy of turning literal lead into literal gold, but alchemy as a symbolic description of what happens to the human soul during transformation. The alchemists believed that in order to produce pure gold, the raw material, dark, heavy, impure, had to be subjected to intense fire and constant pressure inside a sealed vessel. It had to be broken down, heated, dissolved, reduced. Your hardest years were that vessel. The pain you felt was the fire, the losses you endured, the betrayals that left you breathless, the collapse of dreams you once built your identity around. All of it was the alchemical flame burning beneath you. And that fire was not there to punish you. It was there to purify. It was burning away what was not truly you. Think about who you were before the crisis. Think about the desperate need to please others, the fear of what people would say, the social masks you wore just to fit in, the limiting beliefs inherited from family, culture, and old wounds, the roles you played to secure approval, the version of yourself built on expectations rather than truth. Those were impurities, not evil, not shameful, but false layers. The fire of suffering is so intense that those layers cannot survive in it. They burn. They turn to ash. Illusions about control dissolve. False friendships fall away. Unrealistic fantasies collapse. You are stripped down. And yet, there is something the fire cannot burn. There is a core within you that is indestructible, a center that remains when everything artificial is consumed. When the false identities are reduced to ashes, what remains at the bottom of the vessel is something concentrated and real. That is your essence. That is the gold. Right now, you might feel like you are less than you were before. You might feel like you have fewer illusions, fewer people around you, less energy for superficial things. You may feel stripped, quieter, more selective. But Jung would say, you are not less, you are more. You are condensed, more potent, more authentic than you have ever been in your life. For the first time, you are not performing. You are not negotiating your identity for acceptance. You are not chasing validation in the same way. You have been reduced to your essentials, and essentials are powerful. The version of you that has survived the fire carries incalculable value. But this transformation is not meant to be an empty spiritual achievement. Jung was not speaking about vague enlightenment detached from reality. He spoke about utility, about real power in the real world. Psychological gold is not decorative, it is functional. Those who survive this inner alchemy develop capacities that simply do not exist in people who have lived easy, untested lives. Observe what happens when someone around you collapses, when a friend panics, when a family member suffers a devastating loss. Most people become uncomfortable. They rush to change the subject. They offer cliches like, "It will all be okay." They try to fix what cannot yet be fixed, or they withdraw entirely because they cannot tolerate the density of another person's pain. They do not know how to sit in darkness because they have never sat in their own. But you can. You can remain present in front of someone who is broken without feeling the compulsive need to repair them immediately. You do not panic at their tears. You do not recoil from their despair. You can sit across from someone in pieces and simply be there. Because you have been on that same floor. You recognize the terrain. Your presence becomes an anchor. Jung understood that this capacity to hold space, to witness suffering without flinching, to remain steady in the presence of chaos, is one of the most powerful forms of healing that exists. People feel safe with you not because of the advice you give, but because of the depth you embody. You emanate the calm of someone who has looked at the monster directly and survived. Without realizing it, you have become medicine. And yet, after the storm, something else often happens. A strange quiet, a disorientation, a sense that the old world no longer fits, but the new one has not fully formed. This can be confusing. When the fire dies down and the smoke clears, you may look around and wonder who you are now. This is not emptiness, it is integration. The ego that once defined you has been humbled. The persona you once depended on has cracked. The shadow you once feared has been partially integrated. And in that integration, a new solidity emerges. You are less reactive, less desperate, more observant. There is a pause between stimulus and response that did not exist before. You do not chase as much. You choose more carefully. You sense manipulation faster. You tolerate less nonsense. You value depth over noise. You are no longer impressed by appearances alone. Something inside you has recalibrated. This is the quiet power Jung spoke about. It is not loud dominance. It is not arrogance. It is grounded authority. The authority of someone who has faced internal chaos and is no longer terrified of it. And when you are no longer afraid of your own darkness, the world loses much of its power to intimidate you. Your pain has expanded your emotional range. You can access compassion without drowning in it. You can set boundaries without guilt. You can love without clinging. You can detach without becoming cold. These are not skills learned from comfort. They are forged in fire. So if you feel different now, quieter, deeper, less willing to tolerate superficiality, It is not because you are broken. It is because you have been transformed. The tragedy did not define you. Your willingness to confront it did. And what stands before the world now is not the same person who entered the fire. It is someone distilled, someone tempered, someone who carries within them a kind of gold that cannot be bought, imitated, or inherited. It had to be forged, and you forged it by staying. Jung observed that people who emerge from a deep inner transformation often enter a strange and disorienting phase, a kind of psychological no man's land. Almost overnight, the things that once felt essential begin to feel unbearable. The superficial markers of success, the constant hunger for social approval, the empty parties filled with forced laughter, the repetitive and trivial conversations that once seemed normal. Now, they exhaust you. What used to stimulate you now feels hollow. The goals that drove you 5 years ago, the ambitions you once defended with passion, suddenly taste like dust in your mouth. They no longer carry life. They no longer carry meaning. You know you have changed. You feel it in your chest, in the quiet gravity of your thoughts, in the way you observe instead of react. There is a new depth inside you, something heavier, but also more real. Yet the outer world has not adjusted. It still treats you as the person you used to be. It still expects the old reactions, the old desires, the old compliance. This creates a painful tension. Internally, you are different. Externally, everything looks the same. This is what Jung would describe as the chrysalis phase. The caterpillar has already dissolved. The old identity has broken down at the cellular level, but the butterfly has not yet broken through the cocoon. It is a space of silence, a space of waiting, and it is terrifying. Your logical mind screams at you. It tells you that you should be doing more, achieving more, producing more. It accuses you of wasting time. It whispers that you are stuck, that you have lost momentum, that others are moving ahead while you are suspended in uncertainty. But Jung would insist that this void is not a mistake. It is vital. It is the cooling period after the fire. When gold is purified in intense heat, it cannot immediately be shaped into something new. It must cool. It must solidify. The psyche follows a similar law. You cannot move directly from destruction into construction. You cannot leap from chaos into clarity without a phase of integration. This waiting is not passive. It is invisible work. It is your psyche reorganizing itself around a new center. The challenge is that you are being asked to trust a process you cannot see, and that request can feel almost cruel. Because if you are honest, your difficult years likely included betrayals that shattered your trust. Perhaps people you relied on disappeared. Perhaps institutions you believed in collapsed. Perhaps justice arrived too late, or never arrived at all. You learned the hard way that you cannot always depend on others. You discovered that systems fail, that promises break, that life does not guarantee fairness. So when someone tells you to trust, something inside you resists. But Jung does not ask you to trust other people. He does not ask you to blindly trust the universe. He asks you to trust your own transformation. He asks you to believe that your suffering was not meaningless, that every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of despair was purchasing your entrance into a higher level of consciousness. Pain was not random punishment. It was initiation. And this is where the final reward begins to reveal itself. What Jung referred to through the ancient idea of amor fati, the love of one's fate. This does not mean you celebrate your suffering. It does not mean you romantically wish to relive your darkest moments. It does not mean you become attached to pain. It means something far more mature. It means you accept that every fragment of your story, even the parts that still ache, were necessary bricks in the structure you now stand inside. You reach a point where you look back, and although you may still hate what happened, you cannot deny what it forged. You see the strength, the boundaries, the clarity, the emotional intelligence that only pain could carve into you. And you realize something surprising. You would not trade your present depth for the naive happiness of your past. You would not exchange your awareness for comfortable ignorance, because the version of you who existed before did not yet know who they were. That depth has given you a rare power the world desperately needs: discernment. Now you see through deception almost instantly. You walk into a room and sense the hidden dynamics before a word is spoken. You feel the tension beneath polite smiles. You recognize the unspoken intentions behind flattering words. The intuition you once ignored or dismissed as overthinking has sharpened into something precise, almost surgical. It is like a radar calibrated by experience. You are no longer easily manipulated. You are no longer intoxicated by appearances. Yes, suffering took something from you. It took your innocence. It stripped away a certain softness. But in exchange, it gave you wisdom. And wisdom is protection. Wisdom is guidance. It steers you toward what is authentic and quietly pulls you away from what is false. It allows you to choose relationships, opportunities, and environments with a clarity you never had before. This is why what comes next is not simply things getting better. It is something far greater. It is the meeting between your new identity and the world that has been rearranging itself to meet you. Jung firmly believed that when a person changes internally, reality begins to reorganize around that change. The outer world may lag behind at first, but eventually it responds. The people who require exactly the kind of strength you now embody are already moving in your direction. The connections that match your depth are forming quietly. The opportunities that demand resilience, perception, and emotional maturity, qualities you did not possess before, are preparing themselves to enter your life. There is work that only someone with your scars can do. There is a mission that requires someone who has endured dissolution and survived it. There are roles that demand empathy forged through pain, leadership shaped by humility, and courage tempered by loss. You were not wasting time. You were in training. Every setback was conditioning. Every heartbreak was strengthening a psychological muscle you did not know you would need. So lift your head. Do not look at your difficult years as a sentence handed down by a cruel world. Look at them as your initiation rite. You walked through fire. You survived the disintegration of who you thought you were. You faced your own shadow, your own fear, your own despair, and you did not disappear. You returned carrying gold, not visible gold, inner gold. Awareness, strength, depth, discernment. The most painful part is behind you. What begins now is the revelation of purpose. Now you start to see why it all happened. Now you begin to understand that nothing was wasted. The silence had a function. The waiting had a purpose. The suffering had a direction. You are no longer the caterpillar, and you are no longer dissolving inside the cocoon. You are at the edge of emergence. Welcome to the other side. Welcome to the life you earned. And if this message resonated with you, If you feel that you are in this transformation or standing at the edge of your own emergence, then this is your place. Subscribe to the channel and become part of a community that is not afraid to question, to go deep, and to confront the shadow in order to discover its hidden gold. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos, because what we are building here is a journey, step by step, into higher awareness, psychological strength, and inner mastery. The next video might be exactly the message you need at the precise moment you need it. Stay connected, stay aware, and continue walking this path of transformation with us.